Margaret Chun was 63 years old when she decided to disappear. For 40 years, she had been the heart of her family. The one who baked pies for Thanksgiving. The one who remembered everyone's birthdays. The one who decorated the house each Christmas with such care that neighbors would slow their cars just to admire the lights. And for 40 years, every single holiday, her family had celebrated without her, not physically. She was always there, of course. In the kitchen, preparing, cooking, cleaning, serving, then cleaning again while everyone else laughed in the living room. "MOM will handle it," her daughter Jessica would say, barely looking up from her phone. "That's what she does." Her son David would add, reaching for another helping without a thank you. Her husband Richard would settle into his recliner, remote in hand, as if Margaret's efforts materialized from thin air. Year after year, holiday after holiday, Margaret never complained. She smiled. She served. She told herself this was love. But love, she would learn, should never be invisible. The breaking point came on Christmas Eve. 3 months before her disappearance, Margaret had spent 2 days preparing a 20-pound turkey, homemade cranberry sauce, 3 kinds of pie, her grandmother's stuffing recipe that took hours to prepare properly. The family arrived at 6. By 6:30, they were eating. By 7:15, they had moved to the living room for gifts, leaving Margaret with a mountain of dishes and half-eaten plates scattered across the table. She stood at the sink, hands in soapy water, and watched them through the doorway. Jessica was filming herself opening presents for social media. David was arguing with his wife about something trivial. Richard had fallen asleep, mouth open, still holding the remote. Nobody noticed she wasn't there. Margaret dried her hands slowly. She walked to the doorway and stood there for 5 full minutes. Not one person looked up. In that moment, something inside her quietly broke. Not with anger, not with tears, but with a profound, crystalline clarity. She had spent 40 years being taken for granted, and she had allowed it. Margaret began planning in January. She told no one. Not her sister, not her closest friend, Linda, certainly not her family. She opened a separate bank account and began transferring small amounts of her own savings money from her late mother's estate that she'd never touched. She researched small coastal towns in Maine, places where she could rent a cottage around for modest prices. She worked quietly, methodically, the way she'd done everything her entire life. By 1 March, she had a plan. She chose the week after Easter. Another holiday she'd cooked for while everyone else celebrated. On a Tuesday morning, while Richard played golf and the kids were at work, Margaret loaded her car with 3 suitcases and 7 boxes of books. She left behind the expensive furniture, the china, the photo albums. She took only what mattered to her on the kitchen table. She left a single envelope addressed to Richard. Inside was a brief note. "I've gone somewhere I can finally rest. Don't try to find me. I need this." Margaret then she drove north, toward the ocean, toward a small town called Pemmican Point where nobody knew her name. The reaction, she learned later, was exactly what she'd expected. Richard called the police, convinced something terrible had happened. The police found her note and deemed it a voluntary departure. No crime, no investigation. Jessica posted on social media about her missing mother, framing it as a tragedy while never mentioning the decades of unpaid labor David called Margaret's phone repeatedly, leaving voicemails that ranged from worried to angry to guilty. But Margaret had changed her number. She had no intention of being found until she was ready. In Maine, Margaret discovered something extraordinary. She discovered herself. The cottage she rented sat on a rocky bluff overlooking the Atlantic. Every morning, she woke to the sound of waves. She made coffee slowly, deliberately, and drank it on the small porch while watching seabirds circle. She read books she bought years ago, but never had time for. She took long walks on the beach, collecting sea glass. She volunteered at the local library, where the head librarian, a kind woman named Patricia, became her first real friend in decades. Patricia never asked about her past. She simply accepted Margaret as she was. "You seem peaceful," Patricia said one afternoon as they shelved books together. Margaret smiled. "I am." For the first time in a very long time, she planted a small garden. She learned to paint watercolors. She joined a book club where women discussed literature with passion and intelligence. She learned what it felt like to be seen. 3 months passed before Margaret finally called Linda, her friend from home. "Margaret?" Linda gasped. "Everyone's been so worried." "Where are you?" "I'm safe," Margaret said calmly. "I'm happy. That's all that matters. But your family. My family took me for granted for 40 years, Linda. They'll survive. Without me, there was a long pause. You're right, Linda said softly. I watched it happen. I should have said something. It wasn't your responsibility. It was mine, and I finally took it. Through Linda, Margaret learned how her family was coping. Richard had to hire a housekeeper. He'd burned 3 dinners trying to cook for himself. Jessica had actually cleaned her own apartment for the first time in years, realizing how much work it required. David had apologized to his wife for taking her for granted. Seeing his own behavior reflected in his mother's departure, they were learning. Slowly, painfully, but they were learning. 6 months after leaving, Margaret finally agreed to meet with them. She chose a neutral location, a small CAF in Portland, halfway between her new home and her old one. She arrived early, ordered tea, and waited. Richard came first, looking older somehow. Then Jessica and David, both unusually quiet. They sat down, awkward and uncertain. David began. Margaret held up her hand gently. Let me speak first. They nodded. For 40 years, I gave everything to this family. My time, my energy, my identity. And for 40 years, you took it without gratitude, without recognition, without even basic acknowledgement. We're so pleased. Let me finish. Her voice was calm but firm. I'm not angry anymore. I was hurt, deeply hurt, but I've healed. I found peace. I've found myself. Tears streamed down Jessica's face. David stared at the table. Richard's hands trembled around his coffee cup. I want you to know I love you, Margaret continued. I always will. But I will never again be invisible in my own life. I will never again sacrifice my entire existence for people who can't see me. We see you now, Richard whispered. God, Margaret, we see you now. I hope you do. But I needed to see myself first. They talked for 2 hours. Real talk. Honest talk. The kind of conversation they should have had years ago. Margaret learned that her absence had shaken them profoundly. Richard had started therapy. Jessica had ended a toxic relationship, realizing she'd been repeating the pattern of taking others for granted. David had become more present with his own children. Her departure had been a catalyst. Will you come home? Richard asked finally. Margaret shook her head gently. My home is in Maine now. It's peaceful there. I'm happy there. Can we visit? She smiled. Yes, but on my terms, with respect, with appreciation. Never taking my presence for granted again, they agreed. All of them. Margaret returned to her cottage that evening and stood on the porch, watching the sunset paint the ocean in shades of pink and gold. She had not moved away to punish her family. She had moved away to save herself, and in doing so, she had taught them the most important lesson of all. That kindness without boundaries becomes invisible, that love without respect becomes servitude, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is demand to be valued. The waves crashed against the rocks below, eternal and indifferent. Margaret smiled and went inside to paint. She was finally, truly home. Sometimes revenge is not about anger. Sometimes it's simply about reclaiming yourself.